Are you looking to build or upgrade your mountain bike without starting from scratch? Maybe you've damaged your frame like I did, but your components are still in great shape. Instead of investing in a whole new bike, you could swap out your parts to a new frame and save big. In today's video, I'll walk you through how I transferred all the parts from my old bike to a new specialized Stumpjumper Evo alloy frame. I'll also add links in the description below for any tools or parts I used. Let's dive in and get building. I ended up picking up this specialized Stumpjumper Evo alloy frame new for $1,000 since they were clearing them out for the new Stumpjumper frame release. Even though it's a few years old now, it's a great frame with all the features of the Carbon Evo, including the adjustable bottom bracket height, adjustable head tube angle, and swap box. Swapping parts onto a new frame is pretty much like building a new bike from the ground up, but you save some time by not having to mount tires, rotors, cassette, and bleeding the front brake. In my case, I did have to swap out the air shaft in the Fox 36 fork to extend the travel from 150mm to 160mm, which I could show in another video if people are interested. It doesn't take too long and saves you from having to buy a new fork. After getting the frame into the bike stand, the first step is to route the rear cable housing and rear brake hose. Because the cables route under a plate behind the shock, it's easier to remove the shock to be able to remove the plate. This frame routes the cables from the back of the bike, above the bottom bracket, and then under a plate around the shock, and then out the top tube of the bike. The frame includes foam sleeves for both the brake and derailleur lines in the top tube to prevent rattling. The next step is installing the fork. The fork steer tube length will determine the maximum height that your stem can be. To check this, set up all the bearings and spacers and your stem on the fork. I usually leave extra steer tube above the stem just in case I want to raise the bars later. Once that height is determined, I make a mark on the fork where I want to make the cut. Then I remove the fork from the bike, which makes it easier to cut the fork. A quick, easy tool to cut your steer tube is a pipe cutter. Follow the line you made earlier and tighten the blade a little bit with each rotation until you cut all the way through. Then, clean up any burrs with a file. I also push the star nut a little deeper into the fork since we cut off some on the top. Clean up any metal filings and grease up all the bearings and assemble the fork onto the bike. Tighten the top cap bolt so that there is no play in the headset, but not too tight that the fork won't spin. Then, finish up the fork install by tightening up the side bolts on the stem. Now that the cables have been routed and the fork installed, it's time to reinstall the shock. Slide the shock into place and tighten down both bolts. I will usually come back and torque these bolts to the recommended spec because suspension hardware can often be a culprit for a creaky bike, and this helps prevent that. Before starting anything else, I like to install all the brake levers, shifter, and the dropper lever onto the bar. I'll install the grips at this time as well just to get a good reference of how far I like my brake levers in from the grips. Then, I will lightly mount the front brake caliper to the fork and install the front wheel. I will be running a 203mm rotor, so I need to add an adapter since the Fox 36 is designed for a 180mm rotor without any adapter. Also, since this is a frame swap, the wheels were already completely set up with tires, rotors, and the cassette. I installed the chain guide and bash guard and then the Shimano threaded bottom bracket. The bottom bracket is a left-handed thread only on the drive side, so make sure to go the opposite way when tightening it down. It's good to start the threads by hand to prevent any damage to the threads and then finish with a torque wrench. Next, I'll install the crankset. Start with the drive side and push the spindle through the bottom bracket. Then, slide the non-drive side arm onto the spindle and tighten down the end cap bolt. Then, tighten down the pinch bolts on the side, and then you're done with installing the crankset. Now we will work on the rear brake. It's always good to start by removing the brake pads and install the bleed blocks so the brake pads don't get contaminated during bleeding the brakes. I'll install the brake insert pin into the brake hose using the pin insertion tool. This tool isn't necessary, but it makes it way easier than the standard method. Feed the rubber strain relief onto the hose first, then the brake hose bolt, and then the brake olive. Tighten down the brake hose bolt while applying pressure on the hose into the brake lever. This ensures that it doesn't back out while tightening the nut. Then slide the rubber strain relief over the brake hose and brake lever. Set your brake levers so they are level with the ground and remove the brake bleed bolt on the top of the brake lever. Install the brake bleed cup onto the lever. Fill a syringe with Shimano mineral fluid and then open the bleed port on the brake caliper. Then begin to push fluid into the hose until you no longer see bubbles in the cup at the lever. Tighten down the bleed port bolt and then remove the syringe. Continuously pull the brake lever until you remove all the bubbles in the brake lever. Once you no longer see bubbles, remove the bleed cup and reinstall the bleed port bolt. Remove the brake block and then clean the brake caliper with isopropyl alcohol. This will remove any mineral oil that may have leaked while bleeding the brakes. Then reinstall the brake pads. Now let's move on to installing the drivetrain. Before installing the rear derailleur, I like to check that the rear derailleur hanger is tightened to the correct torque spec. Then I install the rear derailleur. I'll trim the shifter housing to the desired length and then feed the shifter cable through the shifter and then all the way through the shifter housing. I'll install the rear wheel, which already has the tire, cassette, and rotor installed since we are swapping it from the last bike. Now I'll install the chain by feeding it over the cassette and through the pulleys of the rear derailleur. Then over the crankset and meeting the two halves together with the quick link. This tool makes it easy to join with the quick link, but if you don't have one, just back pedal till the quick link is above the chainstay. Then hold your rear brake and push the crankset forward. You should hear the quick link snap into place. I'll adjust the rear brake at this point by pulling a few times on the brake lever with the caliper loosened up, and then hold down the brake while tightening the bolts. This usually gets it pretty close, but sometimes could still need some more adjustment. My rotor is pretty old and bent, so it rubs a bit, but I'll straighten it out later. To adjust the rear derailleur, I start by clamping down the derailleur cable while the chain and shifter are in the smallest cog. While the chain is still in the smallest cog, I will adjust the high limit screw. Then, I shift to the largest rear cog and adjust the low limit screw and the B tension screw. After that, I will make sure the chain shifts to each cog without any clicking or delay, and make any small adjustments by adjusting the cable tension using the barrel adjuster on the shifter. Then, I'll trim the cable and put a cable crimp on the end. Now to set up the dropper post. I start by removing the dropper post from the frame and then feed the housing through the frame until it comes up the seat tube. I trim the housing to the desired length. Then, I'll attach the cable to the dropper post and feed the cable starting from the seat post side and all the way through to the front of the bike. Then, I'll insert the dropper post and clamp it into the frame. I'll head to the front of the bike and feed the cable through the dropper lever and then clamp down the cable. Then I will trim the cable and crimp on the cable end. Last component to install is the seat. Assemble the seat post hardware and tighten the front and rear bolts to adjust the seat to the desired angle. Most people like the seat either flat or slightly nose down. I'll do a quick check on the dropper post to make sure it stays all the way at the bottom and then returns all the way to the top. And that wraps up the Stumpjumper Evo alloy build. As you can see, transferring parts to a new frame is a great way to refresh your ride while keeping the cost down. With the right tools and a bit of patience, you can create a bike that feels brand new without replacing every component. If you found this video helpful or have any questions about specific steps, drop a comment below. And if you're interested in more how-tos like extending the fork travel or fine-tuning brakes, let me know. Thanks for watching and happy riding.